So with this conference marking the 50th anniversary of the publication of High Windows, it also reminds us that this was the final collection of poems that Larkin produced, and that the years left to him brought little in the way of new poems that were seen publicly before he died. The complete poems offers just 11 more poems published in Larkin's lifetime. Of these, it would be easy to ignore the one known by its first line, "Dear Charles, my muse asleep or dead." But I think it would be a mistake to do so. Andrew Motion says that Larkin considered Dear Charles to be doggerel, and it would be hard to disagree. He uses the word in the poem itself. At 37 lines, it's longer for Larkin, 17 rhyming couplets with a triplet on the end, and a rhythm that breaks down a bit as the poem starts to lose momentum. So it doesn't display any of the technical virtuosity that we would expect from Larkin, but this apparent lack of craftsmanship may be intentional. It was written to order, which seemed to happen more and more towards the end of Larkin's life, with several of the poems published after High Windows being commissioned or marking significant events, anniversaries and birthdays. Dear Charles falls into that category. It was written to celebrate a birthday. Being a response to a request to write a poem still makes it unusual for Larkin, but it does not make it unique. We know that Larkin did dedicate poems to people. It's more unusual, and I think this may be the only time he does it publicly, for Larkin to name the person he is writing about in the poem itself. So who is Dear Charles? Dear Charles was Charles Causley, born in Cornwall in Launceston in 1917. He left school to work as an office clerk, then served in the Royal Navy during the war. After demob, he trained as a teacher, returned to Launceston, and for the next 35 years, he taught in the school where he had been a pupil. He received numerous awards and honours, Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, the CBE, and when in his old age he heard that he was to be made a Companion of Literature, he said, "My goodness, what an encouragement." And he wrote plays, short stories, essays, journalism. He compiled several anthologies of verse. Then, when he died peacefully at the age of 86, the one word inscribed beneath the name on his gravestone was poet. His collected poems runs to more than 400 pages. His collected poems for children is more than 400 pages. There is some overlap between the two. Neither is complete. He's buried 187 paces from the front door of the house he was born in. Patrick Gale, who wrote a novel based on Causley's childhood, said, "Of our great poets, he was less sexy even than Larkin." There are no drugs, no benders, no vendettas, no suicidal lovers. But he was, and is still, loved, Dear Charles. We know that Larkin was aware of Charles Causley quite early on. In 1957, he reviewed Causley's third collection of poems, Union Street, and although he does have some reservations, Larkin says Causley's poems are both often brilliant and very funny. He also says that they're nearer the popular conception of poetry than the other three books reviewed here. I do wonder if what Larkin is suggesting is that Causley shares something of his conception of what popular poetry should be. Nearly 30 years later in Dear Charles, he will say that your truth and sense we count on as a sure defence against the trendy and the mad, the feeble and the downright bad, which does allow Causley to represent some of the values that Larkin himself holds dear. And Causley is reading Larkin. He includes At Grass in an anthology he publishes a couple of years later called Dusk and Dawn. So they are aware of each other's work, aware of each other too. And when the issue of the laureateship comes up in 1973, they're both being talked about as candidates for the post. Once he's been appointed, Betjeman says that if he'd been asked who should get the job, he would have suggested Larkin or Causley. The University of Exeter holds the Charles Causley archives, and there are a couple of Larkin-related items in there from 1974, the year of High Windows. The first is a letter from Larkin concerning the Gregory Awards. Larkin writes saying he's read the submissions and, as usual, find it difficult to praise any one wholeheartedly. He picks out a couple as being a little further forward than the other, but not much. None of them seems likely to hit the jackpot. as Causley would say, what an encouragement. Then he signs off by saying, I hope this is some help. Then in July, there's a letter from Larkin on behalf of the Poetry Book Society asking for a contribution to that year's Christmas poetry supplement. He signs in his own hand, yours ever, Philip, and then adds at the bottom, my intention to visit you has been thwarted by moving house. He's now at Pearson Park, and he says, I still hope I can do it sometime. As far as I'm aware, he never did, and maybe that's why, as he says in Dear Charles, my view of Cornwall's rather hazy. There were holidays in South Devon, but I'm not sure if he ever managed to cross the Tamar. We don't have a selected letters of Charles Causley, and from what there is in the Causley archive, it seems he wasn't in the habit of keeping copies of the letters he'd sent, so it may be that we won't know how or why that intention to visit came about. Larkin's biographers bring Causley into the story in March of 1979 when Ted Hughes writes to Larkin inviting him to help judge a poetry competition in The Observer. The other two judges are to be Charles Causley and Seamus Heaney. Hughes's biographer, Jonathan Bates, says the competition attracted over 30,000 entries. And there is a photograph you can see online of Hughes, Heaney and Causley sat around a table reading them. The reason Larkin isn't in the photo is not because he's the one taking it, it's because he only agreed to take part if he didn't have to do the shortlisting. Even so, by the time it came to help choose the winner, he's getting quite grumpy about the whole thing. The plan was for the judges to spend a weekend together in Todmorden and make their decision. And before he sets off, there's a letter to Judy Edgerton where his view on the poems on the shortlist is, personally, I wouldn't give 10 pence for any of them, but there, I wish I'd never got mixed up with it. The weekend itself sounds like a Radio 4 afternoon play waiting to be written. There is a brief description of it in Bates's biography. It seems that Hughes was in favour of a 35-page celebration of a baboon in a nightclub having complicated sex with a beautiful woman. Heaney quite liked it. Causley thought it was obscene. Larkin said that if it won, he'd disassociate himself from the prize. That draws a line between Larkin and Causley on one side, Heaney and Hughes on the other. The whole thing starts to fall apart when they try to change the rules and award 6 £1,000 prizes rather than one prize of £6,000. Everyone goes home, and there are some fraught exchanges afterwards to decide the winner. We have a letter from Larkin describing it as a fearful weekend, and the thought that someone is going to receive the prize money for some utter bollocks makes me want to do some damage. He then calls Ted Hughes the Incredible Hulk, Seamus Heaney the Gombeen Man, which apparently is an Irish expression meaning a kind of spiv, I believe. Causley, he says, is nice enough. And although that sounds like damning with faint praise, to come out of the experience of that weekend and be called nice enough is quite something. Bearing in mind this is a letter to Kingsley Amis, it's quite something else. Causley's not being savaged or dismissed or ridiculed here. Larkin doesn't seem to want to make him a target in the sort of games that he and Amis liked to so cruelly play. I imagine that taking Larkin's side against Hughes would have helped, but there may also be some affection here. It says something of Causley that after the weekend he was able to maintain good relations with all concerned. In Dear Charles, Larkin notes that you make lasting friends with all you do. That sense of goodwill towards Causley continues. Larkin contributed to a whip round to mark Causley's 60th birthday. Then he's asked to write a poem for a collection being published to mark Causley's 65th birthday, Poems for Charles Causley. And here it is. On the list of contributors there's a reunion from the Todmorden weekend with Hughes, Heaney, and of course Larkin. And this is where Dear Charles was published for the first time. If you come across it in the collected poems or the complete letters, where it's the complete poems, where it stands alongside Larkin's other works, then it is easy to accept the way he rather dismissed Dear Charles as doggerel. But we'll see that it meant something more to him than that. And when you read it in Poems for Charles Causley, Dear Charles is a breath of fresh air and quite fun. Essentially, I think Larkin was one of the poets who best understood the brief and does write something to celebrate Causley's 65th birthday. I like his praise for humans who don't find it sinful to mark your birthday with a skinful. But perhaps we can be generous and say that maybe its more laboured moments are a parody of the type of verse found in the cheaper cards available to buy in Clinton's. But in this context, Dear Charles does stand out, and I think it soon becomes clear that some of the other writers see the sense of occasion as second to what they have to offer to mark it. All I'll say about that is that the Ted Hughes poem is called Little Whale's Song and includes a reference to the loftiest, spermiest passions. Nothing says happy birthday quite like lofty sperm. I also think that when Larkin commends Causley for his truth and sense, we can see him reflecting that in his plain, honest language with words like admiration and friendship, as in the letter to Kingsley Amis. There is genuine affection here. I do think that Larkin has some affection for the poem as well. It finds readers outside of poems of Charles Causley. When it's reprinted in the New Zealand edition of The Listener, Larkin replies to the editor's offer of $45, asking for it to be rounded up to 50. So even if it is only doggerel, he does see some value in it. And he's not prepared to just let it go. And when the BBC includes Dear Charles in a broadcast dedicated to Causley, it's Larkin who reads it. I've not been able to find a copy of that. If anyone here has one, I would very much like to hear it. Perhaps that additional effort taken to go and make the recording of the poem does show something of his commitment to it. Dear Charles appears again in another birthday tribute, Causley at 70, published in 1987. There's a reunion for the Todmorden Four. Heaney contributes a new poem, as does Hughes. Very different to Little Whale's Song. This one's called Birthday Greetings, and it has no lofty sperm at all. By this time, Larkin has died, and Causley is strangely silent. There is some quite touching personal correspondence between them shortly before Larkin's death. Causley writes congratulating him on being made a Companion of Honour and says, "You'll know, I hope, how greatly I've always admired your work and personal example. It's a beacon, an inspiration." And Larkin replies saying, "You have set a better example to England's poets than I have, and you are always my candidate for the laureateship." Causley wrote well on poets, John Keats, John Clare. His poem about John Betjeman was chosen by Larkin for his Oxford Book of 20th Century Verse. Causley also wrote well on poets who had recently died, and there are poems marking the death of W.H. Auden, Cecil Day-Lewis, and the poem he wrote on the death of Louis MacNeice was also chosen for Larkin's Book of 20th Century Verse. But publicly, when it comes to Larkin and Larkin's death, Causley is silent. There was nothing from him in Larkin at 60, nothing in An Enormous Yes, the posthumous collection of tributes edited by Harry Chambers. It seems that Causley was due to contribute. There's a note in his diary for 1986, PL piece for Harry Chambers by now. Maybe it wasn't finished, maybe it was rejected, maybe one day the Causley archive in Exeter will tell us more. One curiosity that has been found is a postcard from Causley to his friend Father Anthony Maggs, a Catholic priest sent after Larkin had died. He writes, "I seem to reread his poems as often as I look in the phone book. They're real companions to me." And he also says, "I expect to see Ted Hughes next week and will tell him about the mass you offered for Philip. I know he will be pleased and appreciative." I don't think it's recognised that his fellow poets were so concerned for Larkin's eternal soul, but maybe it also suggests that Causley and Hughes were both Team Maeve rather than Team Monica. But as I said, when Larkin dies, publicly at least, Causley is silent. I would not like to be fanciful and say that maybe something of Causley's own muse died with him, but I will say that around the time Larkin died, something in Causley's own writing is changing. It may be the fact of getting older and the significance of those birthdays, but he is becoming more introspective as a poet, looking to make some sense of the past, thinking about death and what that means. And Larkin's passing does seem to coincide with some of the more reflective verse we find Causley writing at that time. I don't think this friendship is one of the most significant in either of these men's lives, but it probably is a little bit more significant than has been assumed so far. And I'll finish by reading one of Causley's poems that came after Larkin died, and he chose it to be the the last of his collected poems, Eden Rock. They're waiting for me somewhere beyond Eden Rock. My father, 25, in the same suit of genuine Irish tweed, his terrier Jack still 2 years old and trembling at his feet. My mother, 23, in a sprigged dress, drawn at the waist, ribbon in her straw hat, has spread the stiff white cloth over the grass. Her hair, the colour of wheat, takes on the light. She pours tea from a thermos, the milk straight from an old HP sauce bottle, a screw of paper for a cork, slowly sets out the same 3 plates, the tin cups painted blue. The sky whitens as if lit by 3 suns. My mother shades her eyes and looks my way over the drifted stream. My father spins a stone along the water. Leisurely, they beckon to me from the other bank. I hear them call, "See where the stream path is. Crossing is not as hard as you might think." I had not thought that it would be like this. Andrew Motion said that if he'd written the last line of Eden Rock, he'd go to his grave a happy and contented man. Dear Charles.